Here's something I've been warning you guys about on several different videos, more than several, actually a whole lot. I've actually talked about this in my live streams. I've actually talked about this when I mentioned demographics. I get questions about this all the time, but now they're addressing this problem directly. It's been it's been hidden. They've been doing this on and off for since 1980, really. And since Bill and Melinda Gates have been over there, they've kind of ramped it up. And now they're going in full gear now. They're shifting gears and they're throwing this into high because it's extremely necessary, especially since China's coming in and putting in infrastructure. I actually mentioned this quite a few times. Anyway, here's the article. Africa needs family planning education to address unsustainable population growth. Booming population will become a problem for Africa by 2050 if the continent does not begin to seriously promote family planning, the report has warned. This warning was contained in the Goalkeeper data report released by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation ahead of the Goalkeepers event in New York. Let's keep an eye on these goalkeepers, okay? It showed that African population is beginning to overstretch the low infrastructural facilities in the continent, leading to mass migration to European countries. Goalkeepers report is released annually by the foundation to measure progress towards UN poverty reducing goals in 2030 based on assessment of 18 indicators. According to the report, Africa's population is projected to double by 2050. Nigeria is the most populous country in the continent and the 7th in the world, with an estimated population of over 198 million. World Population Prospects recently projects Nigeria's population will double by 2050, making it the third highest in the world. To slow down population explosion and poverty rate in the continent, the report urged Africans to shift toward wanted births or reduce early births by improving women's knowledge and access to contraceptives. In that case, the continent would have to quadruple its efforts just to maintain the current level of investment in health and education, which is too low already, the report stated. The report, however, says if the rate of population growth slows down, there will be more resources to invest in each African's health, education, and opportunity. In other words, a good life. To be very clear, the goal of family planning programs is not to hit population targets. On the contrary, it's to empower women so that they can exercise their fundamental right to choose the number of children they will have, when, and with whom. Fortunately, empowering couples to make decisions about their lives also improves Africa's future by changing the population growth scenario across the continent, it added. Billionaire philanthropist and co-founder of the foundation, Bill Gates, said the world has done a great job on many of these issues they are working on. Mr. Gates said in the last 20 years, extreme poverty number came down by 1 billion. And looking at the world as a whole, the actual number of births in the world is quite flat. He however, said underneath that there has been a shift of births from some of the richer countries to a lot of the more developing countries. If you just take Africa, even though it's only 14% of the population of the world, it's 24% of the births already. And over the century, it lights up and becomes half of the births. So you actually have a lot of population growth in Africa, even though the globe as a whole, the growth isn't that dramatic. Mr. Gates said about family planning, the biggest thing is what is called the modern tools of contraception. There are the implants, there are the injections, there's IUD. Obviously, if those things are available, then people are more in control of being able to space their children. Although it's not a direct goal in our case, but it also does reduce the amount of abortion if you have great access to these family planning tools. Mr. Gates also explained that there are talks against contraception issued by the United States President Donald Trump. They, however, will not relent in their effort to make the product available to as many women in Africa who might need them. He said the United States is the only country where the contraception issues are such that sometimes the funding is more generous and sometimes there are restrictions on it. Mr. Gates also added that though the overall funding on reproductive health from the U.S. has stayed high, being the biggest funder, other European donors are also involved. He argued that there should be no cut at the reproductive health funds because there is no clear way that something would come in and substitute for it. He added that some religious groups, including Catholic Church, also have some issues with contraception. So those things are somewhat of a headwind as we're going out and saying, hey, every woman who wants to have access should have access. Let's improve the tools. Let's make them cheaper, which we've made a lot of progress on that. Let's make them easier to administer. And the injection called Sayana Press was produced that a woman can provide to herself. Also in the report, Alex Eza, a visiting fellow, Center for Global Development, said Africa needs to bring back talks about population control because most women in sub-Saharan Africa have an average of 0.7 more children than they want. He said if that number went down to 0 over the next 5 years, the population in 2100 could change by 30%. Mr. Eza also said improvement in education will help reduce population explosion as there is a link between empowerment and population growth. He said educated girls tend to work more, earn more, expand their horizons, marry and start having children later, have fewer children, and invest more in each child. This will also help the shift in the age at which women give birth to their first child. The average age at first birth of women in Africa is significantly lower than any other region. Currently, it is 20 or younger in half of African countries. Their children, in turn, tend to follow similar patterns, so the effect of graduating one girl sustains itself for generations, he said. I'm not surprised that Bill Gates is doing this and actually having now public meetings and with public publications because it was hidden before. I wouldn't be surprised if George Soros started to get in on this. Demographics for white people is a very, very major thing. If as big as the African continent is and as much resources as it has and as big a landmass as it is, to have only 14% of the world's population is meager. To have a population roughly the size of Europe's is meager, especially when the African continent is like 4 times the size of the European continent. The only reason that they know that the only reason the birth rate is so low and the population is so low is because high infant mortality, probably high miscarriages because the women don't get enough food, and also a low standard of living and a low life expectancy. I do believe the life expectancies for most of the countries in Africa is like 51 or 52 years old, rather than in the 80s like in the Western countries or even the Asian countries. So if you make that shift, they're probably underestimating the amount of children being born. Because if we're almost at 1 billion and they pretty much just surpassed the European continent by 2050, which is, they're talking 2050 is what? 2 generations, 1.5 to 2 generations. You are talking about doubling or almost tripling the population. So you could have 2.5 billion people on a continent where Europe is actually losing people. That makes Europe very nervous because, as Quigley says, a fast-growing population will overtake a slow-growing one or one going backward. So I am not surprised to see this kind of article, these articles pop up. And I have a couple of more that I probably need to read into the record. But for you Pan-Africans, keep an eye on this. Keep an eye on Bill Gates. You know, the Pan-Africans have been watching Bill Gates for the last 20 years, which is the reason that they want to educate the women and not the boys. The women are the gatekeepers of sex and also reproduction. So if you can give education and contraceptives to women, the African fertility rate will follow a similar curve as the Europeans and even the Asians. Korea's birth rate went from, I think it was like 5 in the 1970s to down damn near 1. So basically, they've cut the Korean birth rate in 50 years from well over 3 down to well below replacement. And that's simply by education and contraceptive. And for I do believe for Europe's survival in the next century, because this is 21st century, for their great-great-grandchildren to actually thrive, survive, and compete, they must make sure that the African birth rate is down to at least where it's at replacement and not above. Because if they can't get this current generation to actually slow their birth rate, because, the African birth rate is damn near 4 or 5. If they can't get this generation to cut their birth rate and they go through with the number of children that they have and they carry this on to the next generation, which is Generation Z, just the demographic momentum will take the African continent to well over 2 billion. And with technology and infrastructure and keeping these people alive, that's going to overwhelm the European continent, because the European continent only has, I do believe, like 500 million, 500 million people. And that's if you count them without the immigrants. It's only like 500 million white people in the European continent. So if it gets to the point where it's double, triple, and quadruple the amount of people, amount of population on the African continent, that's troublesome for Europe, especially since Europe eats off of the African continent. What happens when the African continent starts using their own resources? That's less for everybody else, which is a problem amongst the West. But keep an eye on this. This is very preliminary. And instead of studying it and then giving it to you in a digestible form, I'm giving it to you raw. So my day ones, actually look out. It's coming. This is a warning. Anyway, check you guys out. Peace.